Okay, we'll begin. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. Calling the regular meeting of council Monday, April 9th at 7 to order. Before we get going, we'd like to acknowledge we are meeting on the shared traditional lands of the Coast Salish people. So with that, could I get approval of the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. So now time for public participation. This is your opportunity to come up and address council with any comments you have. Please remember to state your name and address.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Sylvie. I am an owner of 3340 Anchorage Avenue, and I have a development variance permit being proposed today to reduce the frontage improvements to nil. And I'd just like to explain why I'm asking to do this. Just to give you a little history, we successfully rezoned the property to allow, because it was slightly smaller than what was allowed for a two-lot subdivision, which is what we're proposing, to build our single-family home. So we're planning on building a passive, and now we're actually jumping that up to a net zero. Sure. So I was giving a history of me and my husband, Lee Garrett, and that we plan on building a single-family home for our family to live in, which is going to be we decided to build the greenest house we can build, which is a passive net zero house. This is now the standard, the STEP code is now approved for a passive house, which is, I think we're 20 years ahead, so I think it's set for 2035 is going to be the standard. But besides that, we're asking for a relaxation on the frontage improvements because what's been determined through communications with city and with our engineers that frontage improvements equal about $180,000 for this. And that is a huge financial burden that we can't meet. So we're really hoping to take the opportunity here today to break it down, look at what's required. We've taken the time to speak with the community, to speak with our neighbors, to see what they want, and they are here today to speak to what they want. And we're hoping that we can come to an agreement which will allow our home to be built. So to begin, I want to talk about what the requirements are. That we are required to widen the street to beyond the 6 meters that it is right now. We're required to add a sidewalk. We're required to add boulevard trees, street lights improvements, and increase the amount of street lights. We're required to put in a culvert, so take away the vegetative swale. And one of the requirements which might be in question was a dip service to put underground wiring. So in our engagement with the neighbors, we told them what the requirements are and we asked them what they would like. And the general consensus was to not widen the street because, as you know, there's been concern on Millburn, and the concern was misuse of the road. So it's being used as a throughway for traffic to get to downtown, and it's a safety concern because of speeding and because it's being overused. So they feel like widening a road would just would actually help, would actually make it worse. It would allow for more speeding and just open up that road as the major throughway. They are in support of sidewalks, and so are we. We are in support of pedestrian safety and of sidewalks. We hope that we can move past today and have the ability to discuss with city how a sidewalk would look. Therefore, because you guys have proposed gravel sidewalks, or whether it be adjacent to the street or adjacent to the property line, just to keep that flexibility open. The boulevard trees, we are very green. We love trees. It might not be conducive on our property to have the set amount of standard trees. So we'd like to keep that opportunity open to discuss with city to see what would be an appropriate amount of trees to put on. We are definitely going to put trees on our property, but whether it goes on the city boulevard, we'd like for that option to be open. The street lights, the city wants it to be converted to LED lights. We have no concerns with that. We do have concerns with the amount of streetlights, and we're hoping that you and the city members of the city can discuss maybe because recommendations are generic. They're not specific to our street. They're just a generic recommendation. So taking this opportunity to just really hone in on what this street needs would be appreciated. So yeah, the amount of street lights are what we feel is excessive. So we hope we take this opportunity to discuss with City what those are. And then, so that would be it. So we really appreciate the opportunity for you guys to just break it down with Brent, each improvements, to see where those would be required. Oh, a really important one is the culvert that is recommended. I guess your standard is to put culverts everywhere. We, through discussions with community members and professionals in the industry, that a culvert is not recommended, that the natural vegetative swell offers ideal filtration for stormwater runoff, which the lagoon and the ocean requires, benefits from. So the other option, which I'm hoping you might consider, is that we are fronting onto 2 different streets, and having to do frontage improvements on 2 different streets is a huge financial burden. So maybe have a look at dissecting that down to maybe 1 street. Any consideration would be greatly appreciated. We'd really hope to move forward with our plans to build our home. And we appreciate your time. And I think that's it.
Thank you.
Today. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to come up? Please.
Good evening. My name is Joe Artebis. I live at 3337 Aloha Avenue. I'm all in favor of infill, and so I'm very happy that this subdivision has been approved and moved forward. But at the same time, I'm concerned about removing the improvements that are required when you do a subdivision. And I think there should be, the improvement should be done. I don't think they should be left for us, the rest of the taxpayers down the road, to put in if we have the option of collecting them now. Extremely concerned about along Millburn. Sidewalk is very much needed along there, and yes, it wouldn't be connected, but in some time it will be, and even if it's only connected for the half of that block, it gives a place to walk. There is a concern about the amount of traffic and the speed of traffic going down there. We can only start to improve that incrementally, not wait for it to happen sometime in the future. So I sure hope we don't reduce the improvements to nil. As for the engineering requirements, I'm not sure. That's up to the council to consider. But again, I hope it's not left to the rest of the taxpayers to pay for later. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Good evening, Rick Marchand, 3508 Aloha Avenue. I'll echo the same comments, but won't say the same words, because I firmly believe it doesn't depend on the size of the developer or the size of the development. It's a fact that we, the taxpayers, shouldn't be left with the burden. Final words were said by the predecessor. Whether some concessions can be made, I'll leave that to you to decide, but as a taxpayer, I think you're setting a precedent if you waive these things completely. I have another point that I'd like to make, and that is in support of agenda item 6.2, which is a letter you're going to be reading this evening from the Victoria Electric Vehicle Club. I fully support this initiative. I'm not a member of the club, so I'm not selling memberships here tonight. But as an owner of an electric vehicle, I can say that the lack of infrastructure, I mean, there are pockets of infrastructure. But if we are going to truly embrace the green way forward as envisaged in the official city plan, the new revision that you're looking at right now, this needs to be taken into consideration now as part of the future development of the city. So I'd like to just make that point. And finally, with respect to agenda item 7.2.1, reading the report of the Chief Financial Officer, the two things that I noticed was that the report itself, at least the front end of it, focuses on 2018 for probably legitimate reasons. I'm hoping that as part of the discussion that occurs tonight, that there'll be an opportunity for him to elaborate on a couple of things. The attachment at the back does deal with the 5-year plan and the rollout to that. But it's not clear to me if some of the underlying assumptions and or growth estimates that were used in terms of developing the 5 years. Now, maybe that was discussed as part of the financial planning committee, but as people that don't always attend all of the committee meetings, I'd like to know and hear that sort of discussed up front before you go to the bylaw activity. And then a couple of funny things that I noticed, so I'll leave that to the financial planner to explain. We're a bad group of people. When I looked at some of the growth estimates, it looks like fines and penalties are going to grow for the next 5 years. And I noticed in other areas it's been flatlined. But I guess we're just a bad group of Western cowboys out here in the Western communities where you expect to get more fines and more revenue generated from us breaking the law. So something to consider. Another thing that maybe you can explain as part of your report is the fact that we're taking out much more in terms of, from a financial perspective anyway, the tax, properties, fines and penalties, all of those things that you've got in revenues and expenses, but then you take out more surplus, or what's the term I'm looking for? Well, you're taking money from reserves. We're taking more out of reserves this year than we're putting in. And I think that's a bad precedent unless there's a reason for it, and it's not clear to me what the strategy is behind that for this plan. There's a lot more I could say, but suffice to say I'll wait to hear the report, and if I've got any other comments, you can get the emails in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Good evening. Good evening. Can you hear me? My name is Mike Henderson. My wife and I live at 3338 Anchorage Avenue. We've been watching with considerable interest this particular development process on Millburn. One thing comes to mind. The owners of this property have applied for a number of variances, and they've been granted individually. Now they get to this last variance, and an obstacle has been thrown up. In my mind, it would have been a lot more fair to them, and maybe more expeditious on everybody's behalf if they'd all been considered at the same time. The other point I'd like to make has to do with traffic. I am gravely concerned about the traffic on Millburn and Anchorage Avenue. Between 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it is at times dangerous. We have traffic coming around our corner off Millburn down Anchorage to beat one car at the stop sign down at the bottom of Lagoon Road. It is very dangerous, and I don't understand why the generic engineering would be applied to Millburn at this particular point. Driving up Millburn, I look at the adjoining properties going up the street, and I think it's not possible to apply this engineering standard of widening that street from 6 to 12 meters. I don't think it's possible in several cases without. Well, I don't know. I don't know how some people would gain access to their property if the street was widened that much. And it certainly flows counter to improving safety on that road. I know that the city has put up a monitor. I don't know of any results from that. It's been up for how long? A year? How long has it been up? I'd like to see some results from that. I'd like to see some recommendations from the city regarding what they're going to do to mitigate the danger on that street. Applying this generic engineering standard goes in the opposite direction, in my view. And I would like to see that considered. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rick Jeffrey, 3329 Hockering Road. I just want to follow up on the traffic issue. I've had some conversation with Councillor Nault on this. I know the city's looking at this issue. However, Millburn and Lagoon Road are now very convenient bypasses and drag strips for people. But even worse, Aloha, Anchorage, and Hockering being a 1 block long street, which nobody other than the people living on it should really be on it for any particular reason, becomes a thoroughfare from, and I'm sorry, it's about 6 to about 9, and it's about 3:30 to 6 every day. And these people are not only coming down the street or up the street, they're coming at speed. So narrower streets make sense, speed bumps make sense, signage makes sense, but something needs to be done because our neighborhood is not a very safe place to walk around in anymore.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hello, my name is Yvonne Ardabiz. I live at 3337 Aloha Avenue. I feel this young couple should have to put in the sidewalks on Millburn and Anchorage. I really don't feel that it should be delayed, that the rest of us should have to pay for it at a later date. And when I hear so many people concerned about the speeding down Millburn, I really think for those people who are walking, a sidewalk is a great safety enhancement. I also feel that this young couple should have looked into this whole matter of subdividing and building themselves a new home a bit further. I mean, we would all like to buy a house and build a house that we can't afford. We would all like to live in something nicer than we can afford. And unfortunately, if that's what the sidewalks cost, I really think they should have to pay for it. Because eventually that lot that they have subdivided and that they build, eventually they say they're going to live in it, but maybe they'll sell it in a year at a profit, and then the rest of us are stuck with paying their share down the road for a sidewalk and culvert or whatever else goes with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Asking a second time. Okay, seeing no one else wanting to come up, we'll move on. So next is the mayor's message. Mayor Hamilton and Councillor Trace send their regrets as they are unable to be here tonight. I'd also like to share with everyone that next Thursday, April 19th, is the 24th annual Greater Victoria Bike to Work Week launch event. It's at Centennial Square from 11 to 1, and as it's getting nicer and warmer outside, it's a perfect opportunity for you to dust off your bike and pump your tires. I believe Councillor Day had a few things to share.
Thanks. Just wanted to bring to everyone's attention, if you haven't already heard, the passing of Esquimalt First Nations hereditary chief Andy Thomas. He passed away suddenly on Saturday. He was known as a champion of Indigenous rights. When I first met Chief Thomas about probably 15 years ago now, he told me quite frankly, this was for our Treaty Advisory Committee, that he wasn't ready to consider a resolution. that the wrongs were too great for him personally, but because it was in the best interests of his children and his family and his nation, he was willing to consider reconciliation. And so I'm just kindly remembering him as someone who was who rose to the challenge that was presented to him, and who stood up for his community and for his family and his extended family. And they are going to be missing him very much in the next little while. And there are going to be 2 events to honor Chief Thomas. The first will be for close friends and the Esquimalt Nation community, and it's going to be in the evening of April 11th in the Esquimalt Big House. And the next event will be the following day on April 12th at 9 a.m., where a funeral service will be held at the Big House, followed by a luncheon, and everyone is invited to attend who would like to. The Big House is right next to the Esquimalt Band Office on Cosapsum Crescent. And to get there, you take Thomas Road off of Admirals Road and turn right at the bottom onto Cosapsum Crescent. And the family is requesting that no images of Chief Andy be shared prior to his funeral, and no photos or video or taping is permitted in the Big House. Parking may also be a challenge, as I'm sure there will be many, many people there to honor him. So people are encouraged to carpool, park, and walk, or take a cab if they're interested in attending. Very sad, very larger than life member of our community. Also, Mayor Hamilton asked me to mention the Humboldt Broncos, because we are a junior hockey community, as are they in Humboldt. And I'm sure that everyone in Colwood is feeling their loss very keenly. It could have been us, could have been anyone. And it's just try to support one another as best we can. And on a more positive note, I wanted to share with you, sometimes we have letters that come in, and we send letters off supporting one position or another. One such letter was written in support of motion M47, which was brought forward by Arnold Viersen, who is the MP for Peace River Westlock. And M47 sought to make a strong commitment to ending exploitation and sexual violence, and to sought to prevent youth from accessing pornography online. And he has sent this very lovely certificate of appreciation from the Parliament. And he also sent a similar thank you to the Victoria Family Court and Youth Justice Committee, along with a request for our feedback on what the top 3 ways that we could make a difference to youth who may be exposed to sexualized violence. So a happy outcome. Motion M47 did pass.
Thank you. Anyone else on council had something to share? Councilor Martin?
Thank you. Just real quick, just a reminder that the Royal Bay Theatre Company is doing a play May 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 11th, and 12th. The play Catch Me If You Can. Tickets are only $12. So please, if you can, try and come out to Royal Bay High School and watch the play. My wife was built all the nurses' outfits, so I was a model. So you can you can be sitting in the audience going, "Why are those so big?" So, but it's a very fun play, and it's great to support our youth. So if you can, please make an opportunity to come out to that as well.
Thank you. Oh, sure.
Sorry, I almost forgot. I just wanted to let you all know that coming up this weekend, it's the annual Association of Vancouver Island and Coastal Communities Convention here in Victoria. And the plan was for Mayor Hamilton and myself to attend. I'm not completely sure if Mayor Hamilton will be able to attend, but I will be attending and bringing back information to the council.
Great, thank you. So moving on, we have adoption of the minutes. We have one set of minutes, 4.1, regular meeting of council from March 26th.
Move adoption, Madam Chair.
All those in favor? Opposed? None carried. That leads us to our next item, 5.1, report from Rick Jeffrey, Chair of the Urban Forest Bylaw Task Force. I believe, oh, sorry.
Hi. It's not just a report from me, it's actually a report from my committee, and we do have a PowerPoint, so which I'm not going to read from, but while we're waiting for that, first of all, I'm a little bit disappointed that Her Worship is not here today. She sucked me into being on this committee. But it's a real honor for me to be here on behalf of the committee, and that would be the real point. We had a great committee. And I have to say this committee really dug in on a complex issue. We had a lot of public input on this, as you well know as councillors, about the existing bylaw and what people thought should happen in the future. Our committee worked very hard to work through these complex things and figure out what the ramifications of each of the recommendations that we were forwarding to council for their consideration would be, and carry those things through to their logical conclusions to make sure that they made sense. We operated on a very collaborative and consensus basis, so you're getting a report that has recommendations in it that are endorsed by everybody on the committee. We had one ex-councillor, Judith Cullington, who's here tonight, who I have to say did a lion's share of the work in terms of keeping us accounted for and tracking all of the things that we had done and talked about, and is the author of this lovely PowerPoint we're going to get to here. Do I operate this thing somehow? There we go. We had 3 professional foresters, if we include Councillor Nault on the committee. We had 2 professional arborists. We had some libertarians. We also had Nikki as a professional landscaper, so we had a lot of expertise in terms of urban forests, forestry, and those kinds of things, and I think that shows up in what we did. I'd like to thank Councillor Nault. His advice and input was, as liaison, was very important in helping us. And I'd also like to thank Paul Preston and Dennis Carlson. They were the ones that had to help us figure out how bylaws actually worked and what the ramifications and how they interface with all the rest of the bylaws and things that go on in the city's world. So they were invaluable in helping us come to the conclusions, recommendations we came to. So we had a mandate from the city. We were looking at the bylaw. We looked at other best practices, those kinds of things. The community was very engaged. We had people almost every night. So they were giving up their Thursday nights as well. We were tasked with making recommendations to council on the development of a revised urban forest bylaw, and importantly, the last part of that sentence, other matters of significance related to the urban forest management in Colwood. So our task was mostly to look at the existing bylaw, which you had put in place, knowing that you were going to go through this process to amend it. But the bylaw doesn't stand alone. First of all, you have to understand that the bylaw probably gets applied to about in 90% of it to individual landowners or residents. It has some enforcement things in it as well, but when you look at the forests in Colwood, and we're trying to get an urban forest here, we have different layers. We have, first and foremost, the at the very base, the individual home and landowners. But we also have city lands. We also have economic development permit areas. We also have lots of undeveloped areas that are subject to development permits. And so how those things unfold over time will determine what kind of forest you have. We also have a number of other government agencies who have jurisdiction over their lands, rural roads, DND, Capital Regional District, those kinds of folks. We also have ALR lands, with the golf course being the biggest chunk there. So all of those things have to be come into consideration when you're planning to have an urban forest and when you're looking at this bylaw. So I will speak more to that later. But as we grappled with our mandate and making the recommendations, we had to consider all of these other factors. So we had guiding principles. Very quickly, we believe, and it's evident in this city, that most homeowners manage their trees responsibly. Public safety, of course, is paramount. We strongly believe that the bylaw needed to be simple to understand, simple to administer, and enforce, and needed to be both reasonable in its application and reasonable in its cost. As I just noted earlier, most of the tree loss that happens is either happening under an EDP or under some kind of development, so the large tracts of land yet to be developed. And that's where the city really needs to put a lot of time and effort in making sure that we have those lands developed appropriately and have appropriate tree cover. Forests are forests. They're not single trees. They are a collection of trees. And so we have a collection of trees across city lands here in different, configurations, sizes, and patches. One of the things as a professional forester can tell you is when we go to try and protect trees, we should do it in clumps or in contiguous patches, not bit here, bit there. Anyways, we noted that most of the tree loss came through through development processes. We also noted that the tree species is changing, the mix is changing, the age class distribution is changing. That's because Colwood's on coastal Douglas fir ecosystem that had natural forest growing here, and as we develop and have moved in, we've been losing that natural forest, and people have been planting other stuff, other kinds of trees. But that's okay, trees are good. So while we want to make sure that we, as we urbanize, we try and maintain some natural tree cover, we also want to encourage people to plant trees. So I've talked about the EDPA areas. Again, the development permits that are required for any tree cutting, and you have requirements for tree management plan. I think, Dennis, if I got it right, finally you beat that into me over time. But we think the principles of the bylaw that we've forwarded here should apply to that. We also have made sure that we've covered a gap in the existing bylaws, which is to say that now if somebody does cut down a protected tree, there are fines and conditions, enforcement ability, both on EDPA lands as well as on regular lands. I'm not very good at PowerPoint, so you'll have to excuse me. I usually just stand here and talk, but in deference to my hard work of my committee. Urban forests and city lands. So you have policies for management of trees on the city lands. And so it should reflect and be consistent with what's required of residents. So the bylaw should prohibit any damage to trees on city lands without express permission. So we've made sure that that's in the bylaw. Beyond the bylaw, so I've talked a little bit about this. Bylaw is just one tool. We really believe that there's a role for the city in terms of incentive and education in order to encourage residents in the city to continue to be maintaining their trees as part of the urban forest. There's a role for the city to play there. We also strongly believe that you need an urban forest management plan. And so that goes back to what I was saying. You've got all these different kinds of lands. You've got ALR lands. You've got other government agencies who you have no control over, but you should be having a dialogue with them about what they plan to do on their lands because they're right in the middle of our city. You have city lands. You have the parks. You have EDPA lands, and you have undeveloped lands. So you need to have a plan on what you want it to look like. If you don't have that plan, you don't know where you're going to go. And we also think that you need to resource this. And my good friend Nikki has been bullish on that, and I owe her to make sure that we highlight that. We don't think you have adequate resources in your budget or in your planning to be able to actually deliver an urban forest for the people of this city. So you need more resources, whether it's a city's parks person or there's more resources, or you go out and you access resources like Tree Canada and other places who can help you provide trees for residents, provide educational materials, all those kinds of things. We need to bring those things together to make sure that they're brought to bear so that we can continue to grow a beautiful urban forest here. We also talked about carrots rather than sticks. And talked about, again, on the resource side, tree days, education, free trees, coupons for trees, planting desirable species from funding that you'll get from permitting and those kinds of things. We didn't get to the point where we thought we could recommend actual program for the city, but the city should look at maybe doing something where if somebody cuts a tree down, they can get a coupon from the city to be able to plant another tree, that's always a good thing to do. So at the end of the day, the whole bylaw essentially revolves around what a protected tree is. We looked with help from city staff on what other people were doing. We also had 2 arborists who operate in the city, so they knew intimately what other municipalities were doing. So we've essentially got a definition for a protected tree up here. I'm not going to read through it, but what the committee, we went around and around on this over multiple meetings, and at the end of the day, this is the criteria that we believe defines what a protected tree should be and how the bylaw should apply. Again, remember that a protected tree is essentially just one of the tools in this whole process, and it's the tool that gets applied to the resident citizen. We have a 1-tree rule, so basically you can remove 1 tree per year on your property, up to half a hectare, and an additional tree for each additional half hectare up to 5 trees. Does not apply to wildlife trees, nest trees, significant trees, those kinds of things. There's a permit required. I'll talk a little bit about the cost of that permit in a bit. And there's a requirement that if you remove a tree, you need to replace a tree. I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. If you're going to remove 2 to 5 protected trees, we're suggesting a simple tree management plan, a permit, but you do not need a qualified professional's report. And there would be 1 replacement tree per tree removed, no security deposits required. The current bylaw is very punitive in terms of deposits. I have a good friend of my wife who lives just behind City Hall here. She has 2 trees on her property that are causing her some problems. She was interested in trying to take them down and had to come and pay the city some $3,000 in security deposits, $3,000 she does not have. So we wanted to make sure stuff like that didn't happen. If you wanted to remove more than 5 trees, well, we thought now you're getting into a little bit more of a impactful situation. So we suggested that there should be a tree management plan prepared by a qualified professional, that you're going to require a permit, and that you should have to replace each tree cut with 2 replacement trees unless otherwise specified in the tree management plan. We wanted to make sure that was in there because if you've got a qualified professional preparing a tree management plan, you might want to put 3 trees in per one you remove or 1. It would matter. It would be the view of the qualified professional. And in this case, we thought security should be required. With respect to replacement trees, we are recommending that the property owner can choose to plant on the same property, or they can pay the city to plant on city land. And especially in the case where a tree management plan may require a number of trees to be replaced, it might not be that that piece of property, for the reason they're removing the trees, they want to put a garden in, a play area for their kids or whatever, they might not be able to replace all the trees, so they should have the option to be able to put those trees on city land. Trees must be 1.5 meters high, so that's a height that we chose to make sure that we were planting trees that had some ability to be able to survive. Because at the end of the day, we want these replacement trees to go on living. We want to encourage folks to plant native trees or food trees. We're not going to restrict it to that, but again, this is an educational thing and something that is consistent with the ecosystem that the city resides in. And again, back to this city providing educational material to help people on the replacement trees. We noted that Saanich has a thing where in their permit process, when you apply for the permit, you pay for the permit and you're required to replace the tree you're cutting down, and they actually provide the tree for you. That seemed to be a bridge too far for the city at this point in time, but it might be something you want to consider in the future. Costs. Okay, well, cost was this. Look, our principle was that the cost of a permit should cover the cost of the permit and no more. This isn't a tax grab for the city. So in discussion with staff, we thought what was reasonable was $75. So you have to apply. It's a $70 fee. If you move forward and apply for the permit, then the $75 goes to the permit fee, which is $75 for one tree and $25 for each tree up to 2 to 5 trees, or $200 for more than 5 trees. Again, this is the cost. This is a cost recovery thing for the city. It's not meant to be punitive to the landowner to try and convince them not to cut the tree down, and it's not a place for revenue for the city. We just wanted something that was reasonable, that looked at covering the costs. And then we said if you choose to put your replacement tree on the city, $250 was not an unreasonable cost to pay the city, because that's what you're going to need to buy the tree, plant the tree, and maintain the tree on city land. So, in summary, we believe that these changes will deter indiscriminate tree cutting while reducing the unnecessary burden on the residents by retaining the requirement for a permit to cut a protected tree, narrowing the definition of a protected tree, simplifying the process, keeping the permit costs reasonable, and having realistic tree replacement requirements. And then finally, clarifying the provisions for emergency removal of hazard trees. We apologize right now. We made you go through a bunch of hoops in the meantime because there was a bunch of people who had hazard trees that needed some help. But we've now come back and said to you, with more lead time and a proper bylaw in place, if you have to remove a hazard tree, you still have to get a permit. And if you have to remove a tree on an emergency basis, you still have to come in and get a permit, even if it's after the fact. And then we've ensured that, and the city planner and bylaw officer were very, as the mayor was when I met her to discuss this job. We've maintained the ability to enforce and levy penalties. Maybe that's where the additional money's coming from. People, cutting trees down. I don't know. Levy penalties for unauthorized cutting in an EDPA or on city property, because there was a bit of a hole there. And then, as I have spoken passionately about at the beginning about this whole urban forest plan and the reason that you need this plan, we think we have some recommendations, or we do have some recommendations relating to the urban forest management in Colwood. We want basically to provide consistent, transparent, and equitable approaches to tree management throughout the city. So whether you're on an EDPA, whether you're developing it, whether you're a resident, it should be transparent, it should be clear, it should be equitable, it should be consistent. We think you need to strike a balance between public and private interests. We think you need to recognize and purposely manage the changing nature of Colwood's urban forest. So this is the whole idea of the natural forest is going away. Let's maintain as much of it as we can in appropriate places, and then encourage people to plant ecologically appropriate species as replacement trees. And we think that we need to encourage this culture of sound urban forest management at all scales, and we really think that the city has a role to play in that. So that's the end of the PowerPoint. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Rick. Councillor Nault?
I had no questions. I just had some general comments to make on this. First of all, I'd like to say it's been a pleasure working with this committee. Very good professionals there. I think we got really good advice where we needed it and when we needed it. Reiterate that, as I demonstrated to the committee, most of the historic tree loss in Colwood has been through development, not through individual homeowners. Most homeowners manage their trees very well and love them. As was pointed out, the bylaw has to be easy to manage, both for the city and the landowners. The interim bylaw is extremely punitive to individual homeowners. If they want to cut a tree, they need all of these professional reports. They need to put a $500 deposit, et cetera, et cetera. So it gets incredibly expensive for an individual homeowner. One thing is the development permit areas are treated quite differently from non-development permit areas. There's a really big difference there. I would really like to see the city look at those differences and see if we can bring that more into line with the bylaw, and that's part of the OCP process. The city really does need to develop an urban forest management plan and provide adequate funding. And I might add also that the city should also consider having an arborist on staff as part of the Parks Department. The rest of the bylaw recommendations are before you. However, the only one I think we should change, we should rethink the change to the protected tree definition, increasing the diameter of a protected tree from 20 centimeters to 60 centimeters. And I'll show you why. That represents a 20 centimeter tree. It would fit inside of this caliper. That represents a 60 centimeter tree. It would fit inside of that caliper. Now, being a PhD in forestry, I can tell you that up to about 60 centimeters is almost a perfect relationship between crown size and diameter. So a tree that's 3 times as big as this, you could cut almost that tree without a permit, would have 9 times the crown area and probably 27 times the crown volume. That is a gigantic tree. I'll pass these pictures down. These are shot on my driveway for council.
Are they the same?
Yeah, they're all the same. Now you can see my wife is standing beside a tree there. That tree is obviously dead, but for argument's sake, that tree, would it be alive, would not require a permit. It's only about 45 centimeters diameter. So by going to 60, I think we're going to be excluding almost every tree on private land in Colwood. Example, I counted them on my lot. I have something like 57 trees, not counting a couple of fruit trees and a couple of small ornamentals. Of those, I could cut down 55 without ever applying to the city. I think by going this big, we have had an unintended consequence of excluding far too many trees from the permitting process. Development permit area, you need a permit for every single tree removed. Not 20 centimeters, every tree. So I have a problem with that. I think we should seriously reconsider that, and probably, since we're allowing cutting down up to 5 trees on a lot without professional reports, without damage deposits, I think we should probably put the bylaw back to 20 centimeters, or not adopt the change of 60 centimeters. Other than that, the committee did a really good job. We've gone from being what I think is a powerful stench in the residents' nose to something that they can live with. I strongly support the idea of a fee that will cover the city's costs, and I strongly report the recommendations for replacement trees because that's what we want to do, is we want to maintain Colwood's forest cover. Thank you.
Councillor Logan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just want to clarify the motion that we're seeking tonight is to refer this to staff for review, right? And then come back to committee of the whole. Still taking into consideration some of the comments tonight. But I do want to just make an observation, and sometimes these types of things are written in such a way where with tones like "you shall not" or "you shall." But this report, I thought really flowed well, and it was written in such a way that was more of a question and answer type of format, so easy for a character like me to understand. But also what it says is that we need to identify a baseline from which to start from, and then identify a goal that we want to attain. And I think that's very important. And the other thing that I think really, it kind of plays in really well with what the residents have been saying too, through the OCP process, and that's, we love our trees, and we ought to be protecting more of them. But what it also recommends is that we, as a municipality, take a really proactive approach and support our residents and communicate with our residents, which we've been getting really good at the last few years. And I think I really appreciated that, because then, if we provide those incentives, people are more apt to participate. And I agree with you, Rick. I think now that, once we establish that baseline and kind of know where we're going, then we'll be in a really good position to dedicate some funding. Like other municipalities have boulevard tree planting programs and that sort of stuff, and it helps the environment, but it also makes your neighborhood look really good. So I really appreciate the work that the task force has done. And it's a lot more actually than what I was envisioning when it was created. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. I will have to say that the committee did really dig in on a lot of these things. And every time we got to, a place, you had to go, okay, if we say this, what does it mean? How does it relate to a whole bunch of other things that come to play? And so I think that thoughtfulness showed up in the report. As for Councillor Nault's view on 20 versus 60, we did spend a lot of time on whether it should be 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or 60. You'll find if you look around most other municipalities, 60 is a standard that they manage to. I would be, I think on behalf of the entire committee, a little bit reticent to see it go to 20 because 20 is not that big. And, I've got a cherry tree in my yard that's, well beyond that. We just didn't think in those kinds of circumstances that the city should be asking to have a permit. What we're trying to do was say there are some big natural trees growing in this city that we want to make sure if somebody takes them down that they have to come and get a permit, right, and show that, that they're going to take those trees down and replace them. So we had to find a balancing point. I fully understand Jason's, Councillor Nault's view on that, but we did kick it around for almost every meeting until we settled on the 60. So,
Councillor Day.
Thank you, and thanks for the report, Rick. It is, as you say, very, very thorough, and I do appreciate that the committee really wrestled with some sticky points and where the unintended consequences might be. Following on that, though, one of the things mentioned in your appendix on the detailed recommendations was to remove the definition for hedge. And I just wondered if you could tell me a little bit about why that.
Well, when you got to 60 centimeter protected tree, you didn't really going to have a lot of 60 centimeter hedges, so it just was redundant.
Okay, and the other issue that I would mention for staff to consider when they relook at this and move it forward is that difference. You know, there's kind of a really arbitrary line for our environmental development permit areas on that map. And without any ground truthing about, you know, what forest exists or what the slopes are in some areas, it does leave a very different definition. You know, there's definitely two classes of properties. You know, those that are in an environmental development permit area and those that are not. And I think that's maybe not quite right because someone who lives in a steeply sloped area may be planting and maintaining trees to solidify and maintain that slope appropriately. And there may be times when they have to manage those trees for safety or for infrastructure. You know, I know for myself, I've planted trees and later had to take them out because they did too well, only to discover, you know, they were too close to a water line or things were going on. And, you know, suddenly your ornamental cherry tree goes from something that's this big to something that's this big in a very short period of time. And you know you have to do something. So there's a lot of places where I feel like we are making our residents pay a very hefty price for a problem that isn't of their making. So I think it's important to remember that the policy that the city adopts is really important, and it was mentioned also in the report. So we do really want to get that policy right about what the city does on its lands, as well as what we're asking our residents to do, and somehow be complementary to one another in that regard. And there are a number of bylaws throughout the province. I noticed the town of Comox has had their tree protection bylaw since 1994. And they have some very good designations for heritage trees and so forth. And they do err on the larger side. And they do rely on arborists as well. And I would also echo the need for qualified staff at the city to be able to speak to the issues around trees. If we value trees, then we need to have staff who know about trees.
You know, the one thing that I will say that we certainly learned along the way is that bylaws are very, very blunt instruments, right? And so you've got a circumstance here where you're trying to develop a bylaw to protect some trees and the public interest in those trees, and balance that off against the private interest of the person that's on that property. And that's why we spent a lot of time, or I spent a lot of time at the beginning talking to you about an urban forest management plan, because you know, we grappled with, okay, you can cut one tree down on a half hectare per year over, you know, if it's protected. Now you go to 2 to 5. Well, maybe we'd like, you know, a tree management plan, and should that be a qualified professional? Should it not be professional? And staff was quick to point out that we couldn't do anything that created discretion, because discretion in bylaws don't work very well, right? And so your policy, to your point, your policy has become very important. In those EDPA lands, they may be riparian, they may be steep slopes. Yes, there's a reason that you need a tree management plan, and that it might vary, but you also want to make sure that you're trying to be, transparent, consistent, equal. And again, if you've got policy that can help guide the application of the bylaw, which is blunt, and you've got an urban forest management plan, then you start to, and then you've got the OCP, and you start to put those things together, and all of a sudden you can property owners get a sense of what's required of them, what's not required, right? What they can do and can't do. So, we've got lots of trees in the city. We've lost a lot. We've got a great opportunity here if we do the plan right to keep this a highly vegetated city and keep its beauty.
Thank you. Councilor Martin?
Thank you. Okay, now you get the dumb questions, Jeff, because I know nothing about trees. And first of all, I want to really thank the committee. I mean, the amount of expertise that was there, we certainly couldn't afford it if we were having to pay for it. So it really speaks to the value of volunteerism with our city. So I really do want to express that.
We can send you a bill.
You can send it over there. The dumb questions that I have, and I'm trying to understand, is, are we talking about, like, what are we talking about when we're dealing with a dead tree? Like, are we talking that, would that person still need to go through the exact same process as in somebody who's just wanting to remove a tree because they don't like the tree, versus somebody that it's just completely dead and actually unsafe? Is there any differential? Did the committee sort of differentiate that?
Yeah, absolutely. If it's a dead tree, it's bigger than 60 centimeters, then you got to get a permit to take it down.
You still do?
Yeah.
Okay.
They don't just die overnight.
Right. Well, and I'm just trying to understand. So what about what?
Like I was just talking to this gentleman here. We both had big arbutus trees, which were mine was bigger than 60 centimeters. They died within a year from a blight, and so I was lucky because there was no tree bylaw. I was able to take it down. But in the current one, it would be deemed a hazardous tree, and if it's big enough, you have to go and get a permit.
Okay.
Right.
Sir, did you want to answer that?
Yeah, I'd like to point out that on the interim bylaw, you had to prove that the tree was dead. If it was protected, you had to prove it to the satisfaction of staff, and that might have required a qualified arborist to tell you that your tree was dead. Under the new bylaw, you just apply to cut down a tree. Yeah. It doesn't matter if it's dead, alive, or...
There's no differential.
There's no differential.
Okay.
So you can cut down up to 5 protected trees on your lot in a year, whether they're dead or not.
Okay. Thank you. Second question I have is, so forget about cutting down a tree. Does this bylaw at all, or was there any recommendations around somebody who just wants to continually add to their property and add trees? Is there any restrictions? Is there any concerns? Is there any specification of which trees they're allowed to put on it? Did the committee or task force get involved at all with that?
Yeah, we did, in the fact that we think that the city should embark on education for city residents on what kind of trees are appropriate to plant in their yards.
Right. Okay.
Right? And there are third parties out there that can help you with that kind of stuff. So it's not just the city having to do it itself. You can reach out to other things. But we think if we want a culture of an urban forest here in the city has a responsibility to help its citizens figure out, what kind of trees to plant, where it's appropriate to plant them, those kinds of things.
Okay. And the final question, this is just for my own education. Can you explain to me why trees do not survive when you leave them by themselves, but they do in a group setting? Like, I can kind of think of the logic of, say, wind, but why are the outside trees still not falling into the inside trees, and then everything falls apart anyways? Why do trees survive when they're left in groups, but not when they're individualized?
Because they're talking to each other. Well, there's a whole science around wind firmness and and interconnections of roots and soil stability and all of that kind of stuff. But suffice it to say that if you want to protect trees natural native trees in the city, you're better off to try and protect them in clumps rather than have them dispersed all over the place.
If I could add a little bit to that one. When trees are growing in clumps, often their roots are growing together as one organism, provides a lot more wind firmness. However, if you take out the surrounding trees, they don't have nearly the roots that they should have. So the problem isn't a Douglas fir tree can't stand all by itself in a forest. The problem is if it's standing in a clump and you take the clump away, it can't stand the winds anymore. So it's not a question of which tree or how big it is. It's a question of you've just changed its entire environment and it's not going to stand. In forestry, they used to try to leave windbreaks up all the time, and I'd go into the forest and see, 300 yards of trees lying on their side because there's only 3 trees deep. And a windstorm came up, boom, they're gone. So that's why we need to really have a forest management for the city, to say, what are we trying to achieve and how are we going to get there?
Yeah, you also spiral trees, the leading edge of the, where the prevailing winds will come from, we'll spiral the trees to let some of the wind go through. We'll design the leaf strips now so they're not just these linear things that are 3 trees deep. They've got some shape and form and where the wind and topography. There's a whole science around it. And that's one of the reasons back to your EDPA areas, you've got these steep slopes here in Colwood where it is appropriate to try and maintain tree cover for soil stability and those kinds of things. So it's also another reason why we think 60 is a better number than 20, because people might need to be able to take out trees before they get to 60 because they are unsafe. So.
Thank you. Anyone else from council? Questions or comments?
That being the case, I would like to move the recommendation with the one rider on the recommendation that staff add a part to the report on what other municipalities have as their protected tree size. I'm sure they've already gathered that number. It would be useful to see what range is available. Thank you. So that's my motion.
Second.
All those in favor? Opposed? None? Carried. Thank you.
It's a real honor to help serve the city.
Thank you, Rick, and to the committee. Okay, moving on to the next section, correspondence requiring council direction. The first one is 6.1, from the Manager of Health Promotion and Community Development, West Shore AVI Health Center.
Thank you, Your Worship. So this is a communication that's coming from a nonprofit organization that's located in Langford, serving the West Shore communities. They're currently open 2.5 days a week. It's a busy clinic that is currently treating 75 patients seeking opiate agonist treatment. I'm not sure if I said that correctly. And among other things, they provide naloxone kits, overdose prevention training, and make referrals for counseling and other types of treatment that people need for mental health or for addictions. They're trying to secure financial support through higher levels of government, and not long ago, Premier Horgan announced a $322 million fund for mental health and addiction, which apparently has not yet trickled into the smaller community organizations. So they're looking for the city to provide a letter of support for the work that they do, which they intend to include with their submission to Premier Horgan. And they hope to meet with him not only to talk about some of their needs, but to get some advice from him on securing financial support.
Thank you. Councillor Jay.
Thank you. I'd like to recommend that we send a letter of support for this clinic. It's often been noted how difficult it is to access services in the Victoria region when you have to travel from the West Shore to a downtown or Oak Bay or other areas due to transportation difficulties. And opioid overdoses have certainly been a huge topic of discussion at the Association of Vancouver Island and Coastal Communities and at the Union of British Columbia Municipalities conferences. and the maps outlining where the problems are located is very much in our backyard. It is no longer just the downtown east side of Vancouver that is having these problems. It's hitting very close to home. They've recently started a public relations campaign to try to encourage people to seek help because it is brothers, sons, fathers, co-workers. Everyone has been touched by the opioid epidemic. And so I think it would be very good for all the residents of Colwood if there were resources close to home. And I would like to move that we read letter.
All those in favor? Opposed? None? Motion's moved. 6.2, a letter from the Victoria Electric Vehicle Club, Vancouver Electric Vehicle Club, and Plug-in Richmond.
Thank you, Your Worship. This request is for Council to join the efforts of other BC municipalities in amending the city's zoning bylaw to require electric vehicles, EV infrastructure in new construction. Our Acting Director of Planning is here tonight. I think he may have a few things he might want to add, or if Council has any questions about the EV infrastructure or changes to the city's zoning bylaw.
Council? Or sorry, Dennis?
Madam Chair, the only point I'd like to make is that the draft OCP does contain provisions around including EV charging, specifically making a recommendation that when we update our land use bylaw, we include that provision. So the request from the Electric Vehicle Association is certainly in keeping with that. And on that basis, staff have provided a motion for Council's consideration.
I'm going to read it out. That staff be directed to amend the city's land use bylaw to require electric vehicle infrastructure in new construction. Did Council have any questions or comments? Councilor Martin?
Thank you. Yeah, I do. I have an electric car, so obviously I am supportive of it. But I guess my concern of just throwing this sort of random thing is without any sort of a financial analysis or financial report on how much this would actually cost. Does this actually take us, and I understand it doesn't cost us anything, but I would like to understand if this hurts our amenities. Like if the money's now being spent towards the electric charging, how does that affect the rest of the amenity charges if we're developing something new?
Through you, Madam Chair, it's early days, but at this point, I don't foresee it being requested as an amenity. The direction that we're including in the OCP is that it would simply be included as part of the land use bylaw, so it would be a standard requirement for any development, as opposed to an amenity that would be just a part of a rezoning application.
So through the chair, what does that mean though? Like, so for example, you have a developer who wants to build 10 single family homes. Does that mean that they're building an electric charging station in all 10 of those homes?
Those are the sorts of decisions that staff would be evaluating as part of determining where it's appropriate to require electric vehicle charging within the land use bylaw. And that would be something that staff would be bringing back to council for discussion.
So through the chair, I guess my question is, should that be something that's staff driven and then just comes back to this council table, or is this something that should be going to committee of the whole so that we can actually have public input and an actual discussion before staff do all this work on this? So I guess I would ask through the chair to staff that question.
Well, through the chair, as part of the implementation of the OCP, as I mentioned, there is a reference to electric vehicle. If council wanted some broad overview from staff, they could certainly direct us to do that. When we come to the point where we update the land use bylaw, there'll be a number of provisions in there that council will be asked to make some decisions on. This will certainly just be one of them. But if you wanted to frame some direction to staff, by all means.
Councillor Day?
Thank you. I think this is much like our Solar Ready initiatives in the past, because my understanding is that you could provide the provision for an electric vehicle charging station, but not actually put all of the infrastructure in place, simply provide the circuit in a wall, in the garage, a circuit breaker, and then deploy that on an as-needed basis. It's very difficult to retrofit, I think, and much easier to plan for it up front in a new home build where not everybody has an electric car, but once you have an electric car, you could certainly make it much easier to implement. So I'm sure that staff would be bringing back some idea, because I did look at it from a perspective of cost and looked at some of the links that were included in the letter as to how it would be included. And certainly, if I was getting an electric vehicle, I would want to have the ability to have a charging station in my home. That would be the most convenient. I'm not sure how you did it, Rob, but I would be interested to hear from staff what the implications would be in terms of cost, because we do always hear from the development community about the cost pressures on them. But my understanding from the electricians in my family is that it's a fairly common thing.
Anyone else from council? Okay, we do have a recommendation before us.
Given that we are addressing this in the OCP and we will be writing the building bylaws to match the OCP, I would just at this point recommend a receipt. So I will move receipt of the letter.
Second.
Discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? One opposed? Okay, so 6.3, email correspondence from Kyle Kerr, President of Victoria Real Estate Board.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a letter that we received from the Victoria Real Estate Board looking for the city to write a letter to Premier John Horgan, the Honourable Carol James, Minister of Finance, and the Honourable Selena Robinson, who is the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, to request that they halt the introduction of the speculation tax as it's currently defined. The board is seeking support in encouraging the government to look at current and future market conditions to create a housing plan that supports growth and investment in Victoria, and would like to see an exemption, Victoria exempted from this, what they call regressive tax. So they're looking for a letter from the city to the three honorables, as mentioned.
Thank you. Councillor D.
Thank you. I won't be supporting a letter to the real estate board on the speculation tax because I agree with the speculation tax. It was the subject of a presentation by, name just left, housing affordability for youth, actually, based on a number of presentations that were done by an economist from UBC, showing how other parts of the world have implemented a foreign buyer's tax to the benefit of the market. It didn't solve all their housing affordability problems, but it did do a lot towards bringing down prices in a very volatile market in other parts of the world. And there was certainly a large presentation with Generation Squeeze is the name of the organization, just came to me. A very good presentation outlining the economics of the benefits of the tax, even though it is seemingly difficult at times. It does level out the market so that it's not as volatile after a speculation tax has been brought in. So I wouldn't want to see anything that supports speculation in housing. There's certainly a need for housing, certainly a need for affordable housing. It's top of mind for so many people. And I think that it's been seen as a way to turn a quick profit in many cases. And I would not want to see us not implement it. I think it's very important that we keep housing as affordable as possible.
Councillor Nolt?
I will throw my own 2 cents in worth there. I agree that we should not be sending a letter. I do support the speculation tax. About 2 years ago, I rented a property up on Aloha Avenue for about a year while my new house was being built. Almost half of the houses on Aloha Avenue in that area sat vacant almost all of the year. These were all people that had bought them as investments, not people that were living in them, and not people that contributed very much to Colwood other than paying the property taxes. So I understand that this might drive down in the short term the prices of existing homes, but they are ridiculously priced as it stands. And not doing anything is only going to increase prices. And they will continue to increase until we find some form of making people live in the homes that they purchase. So I will not be supporting a letter to stop the speculation tax.
Councillor Logan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And admittedly, I don't know a great deal about the intricacies of the tax, but I worry about the unintended consequences that I'm hearing in the media. So you have somebody going to UVic where their parents buy a condo for their child to live in while they go to school. This tax applies. So now they have to sell their condo because they can't afford the outrageous tax for their kids to go to school, to UVic or Camosun. The other example that I've heard in the news is those that are in the forces that get posted back east don't want to sell their homes here for obvious reasons because they intend to retire here. They're getting hammered as well. So there's, I'm not saying that nothing ought to be done, but I'm not sure that this is the right vehicle, or perhaps all the bullet points in the speculation tax are appropriate, because I think it's also having some consequences that may or may not have been envisioned when the tax was thought up. So certainly I have no problem in urging council to write a letter to have the province at least take a sober second look at the tax, just to make it to target it to those that it was originally designed, not the working stiffs that are trying to support their kids to go to school, or those that are posted elsewhere and intend to retire here. And so, but I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Anyone else?
Me?
You don't have anything to say for once?
Sure. Yeah, no, I didn't. Well, I do have an opinion, but I wasn't going to say it. But I am supportive of the speculation tax. I think you just have to look at your other jurisdictions like Prince Edward Island. Prince Edward Island, you're not allowed to buy waterfront unless you're an actual resident of Prince Edward Island. And so I don't think this is outrageous. It also is just controlling the out-of-control pricing that's happening right now that we're seeing in Greater Victoria as well as Vancouver. There are some unintended consequences that the provincial government will definitely have to clean up, but I do have faith that they recognize that they'll need to do some reasonable changes to that, so I will not actually be supporting the letter this evening. So I will make a motion to receive.
Second. Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? None carried. Okay, so that takes us to new business, transportation and public infrastructure. 7.1, report from the Manager of Development and Subdivision Services for application DBP 18003 to vary frontage improvements for the subdivision of 3340 Anchorage Avenue.
Thank you very much. So the property, as we've heard tonight, has been rezoned to permit a two-lot subdivision. At the time of zoning, the developer was aware of the requirements to provide improvements to local streets, and it was discussed on the timing of when that consideration could come forward. And unfortunately, it didn't come forward at that time, and the full costing analysis of those improvements weren't known at the time. Through that zoning process, the developer did commit to build a new house, and as we've heard tonight, that house is going to be of incredibly high energy efficiency. The variance request was discussed with the applicant, as was the fact that staff could not support the variance request in regards to a positive recommendation due to the fact that the improvements relative to the subdivision are a factor of a bylaw set by council, and that the bylaws to be equally applied to all development properties. The request is to vary the frontage improvements to zero, or to nil. Staff do not have the ability to apply a modified standard or to modify the present workings of the bylaw without council consideration. Hence, this is before us. So the bylaw requires that the fronting streets, whatever they may be, and in this case there's two fronting streets, are improved to the center of the road to the standard of the bylaw, which calls for road widening, which is intended to enable a greater surface for both motorists and cyclists, also improve lighting, construct sidewalks, and also infill the ditch works to improve the boulevard, or considered improvement of the boulevard. The estimated value of these works is between $180,000 and $200,000, as there are two fronting streets to this parcel of land. In considering the bylaw, council may wish to note that the bylaw is old. It's a 1995 bylaw, and staff do have intention to bring forward for council consideration in short order a revision to that bylaw, and they may wish to consider the existing character of the neighborhood. And note that improvements in this area would be the start to a change to the look and feel of that local character. The request for a variance to reduce the improvements to nil is due to the high estimated cost of the required works. Council can choose to vary any portion or any component of the bylaw, to vary specific aspects, or to vary all the requirements of the bylaw to nil as is requested here. For example, if council feels that pedestrian safety remains a priority, council may choose to retain that requirement of sidewalks, for example, and reduce others and so forth, and may pick and choose from the list. It may also be council's wish that until a plan for the local area is known, that any improvements be delayed by either the establishment of a reserve fund, or by asking the developer provide cash in lieu, which would enable the city to construct those works at a later date. Cash in lieu does have complications because every year that we don't spend it is a potential reduction in the value of that money due to the cost of inflation. The area has seen very little development action, and there is limited development potential by subdivision alone. Most of the properties, if they were going to be considered for development, would require rezoning consideration. It's anticipated that without works undertaken by developers, improvements to these local streets would require capital expenditure from the city. This complicates the council consideration, as if the developer did construct a sidewalk, it would have no connectivity to another portion of sidewalk until either an adjacent development enabled those works to continue, or council elect to budget for capital works in the area in the future. This area has recently been under review by the engineering department in the city in regards to speed and traffic calming, as we've heard tonight. Whether any traffic calming measures are necessary is presently unknown. The Speedwatch data recorders are gathering that information. Traffic calming measures are not part of the development and services bylaws as it stands today, and do not form part of the requested improvements to this area. We've insofar received 2 objections to the variance request, which are attached either in front of you or into the report, and both objections speak in favor of a degree of local improvement undertaken by the developer. I'm here to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks. Questions from council or comments? Councillor Day?
Thank you. I think we looked it up earlier quickly before council, because I was remembering a number of properties on Millburn. Turned out it was in and around 2006 when a number of homes were developed on Millburn. and the frontage improvements were not done at that time, and instead we received an offer of cash for the sidewalk fund to be used in areas that would be more appropriate or more useful to the community as a whole, rather than to have one little orphan piece of sidewalk in front of a couple of houses on the road. And then, we would have actually had like 2 houses with sidewalk in front of them on one side of the street, and on the other side of the street we would have had one house with a sidewalk in front of it. And where you could see the benefit of that would be an area where this house is now going to develop and they'll carry on the sidewalk. But because this is an older established neighborhood and the likelihood of more development in that area is very unlikely, I would far rather see an offer come to the city of money towards the sidewalks close to Sangster Elementary or any of the other areas that are identified. We do have a reserve fund for sidewalks. Or another suggestion that was in the report was to obtain cash in lieu for improvements so that the timing of the improvements can be related to a neighborhood concept with the establishment of a reserve fund for local improvements. So if we'd rather see it be in that same local area, but something different than just what this standard says should be there. It's also certainly not in the Millburn area that I can recall, but I know other areas who have been, a corner lot has had a great, that's double the cost when you're on a corner lot to do the improvements. We have certainly had contributions to the sidewalk amenity fund so that some other area within Colwood that requires a sidewalk that will be more usable by more people could be done. So I don't want to prejudge what other people may say, but that's where I feel would be in the best interests of the city. When we take a deposit, and there are many of them, from a development to do frontage improvements at a particular location, that's where those funds get used for. It doesn't get spread out. It doesn't disappear. We have contributions that have been on file with the city for 25 years, some of them, and they're all carefully documented and maintained. And I just remember from going through it at audit time, because what's this list all about? And it's sort of a bummer that we have all this money tied up here and we can do absolutely nothing with it because it isn't that street that requires the development. So I would really like to see it used in a more positive way that facilitates the development of the community in the right way, not an extra wide street where we're already having speeding problems. And I'll look to hear from other members of council.
Councilor Martin?
So I did speak to the proponents last week, and I've had an opportunity to talk to Brent. But I'm trying to think, approving officer? What is your title right now? Approving officer? I hear what Councillor Day is saying. I've also heard very clearly from the community in general that, Millburn does need to have work done on it as well, and I would hate to shift that work from Millburn to somewhere else. I really think that neighborhood deserves that work to be done there. For myself, after sort of examining everything, and if we were to look at recommendation number 3, I agree that we should not require that they do A, which is widening the road from 7 meters to 10 meters. My rationale for that, and I will look to our Director of Engineering to correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is the idea of keeping a road narrow is one of the ways to slow roads or slow traffic on that. So by actually increasing the width, we may be doing a disservice to that community, because that may actually increase speeds versus decreasing speeds. So that would be my one concern, or that would be my rationale of not requiring that. As well, I'm comfortable with D as well, which is vary the underground storm drainage pursuant to Schedule 3A to nil. Because if we don't widen the road, we don't need to do anything with the storm drains. I believe there's a ditch there right now that would just work just fine. I do think that we do need sidewalks, and I do realize it's one of those things that is just out in the middle of nowhere for a little while. That actually it exists right now on Portsmouth. There's a house that has sidewalks in front of it, but nobody else does, so it does look a little strange. But you know, we are transitioning from a rural to an urban setting, and I think eventually Millburn's going to be required to have sidewalks down that entire road to keep pedestrians safe. The other things I actually think should be done in the neighborhood, so I won't be discussing any of those things, but I would feel very comfortable with not requiring that the road be extended, or that the strain dormage, whew, thank you, is required. Thank you.
Councillor Knoll?
Thank you. I think we have to take the long-term view on this. It's either the person making the profit from their subdivision pays for it, or the taxpayers pay for it. There's no in between. I do not support any variance. I might support requiring improvements on one street only, given that it is a corner lot. I'll give an example. My neighborhood, when I moved in 25 years ago, it was open ditches, no sidewalks, and now there are very nice sidewalks for quite a ways along Belmont Road. There's nice street lighting. There is some boulevard improvements. There's a little bit of road widening. There's parking pullouts. It didn't happen overnight, but the developers paid for it. Interestingly, the sidewalk ends in front of my house, because when I built my new house, I didn't ask for a rezoning. I didn't ask for a development permit, so I didn't have to pay for any of that. I knew full well that should I ask for those, I would have to pay for them. It sounds like the proponents knew the same thing, and we're getting the death of 1,000 variances here. So I will not be supporting any variance except maybe the recommendation that only one of the roads be improved to full standards.
Anyone else? Councillor Logan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Tonight I heard a couple of terms: generic engineering and bylaws are blunt instruments. And I think you know, if we were talking about a project that included say 6 townhouses or more, then I think we could reasonably expect absolutely full frontage improvements as required. But I guess when I'm looking at this, I'm looking at, okay, what's reasonable as well. We're talking about one additional lot. So not a lot of densification, but the bylaw being a blunt instrument mandates a certain amount of improvements. What I did hear tonight is a lot of agreement between the applicant and the neighborhood, in that, yeah, we should have some sidewalks. Yeah, we should have some lighting. Let's talk about the amount, and yeah, we should have some trees. Let's just have a discussion. So there's a lot of agreement that we can build from. So I agree. I think, you know, our Brent there stated that you know, this has the opportunity to really improve and light up improvements in the area by providing the sidewalks and some of these improvements. So I think it's important that we do build the sidewalks, that we do have some lights. I agree that keeping the road narrow is probably preferable, and it sounds like the neighborhood is saying that as well. So that's a good thing. And you know, in terms of enclosing the drainage, the new flavor seems to be rain gardens as well. So you know, maybe not a ditch, but nice rain garden or a glorified ditch, as I called it in the past. But they've been proven, like on Latoria Road as an example. You know, they're pretty inexpensive, but they're landscape. They look attractive, and they accomplish what probably a better result at the end of the day for the lagoon. So I'm not sure, Brent, if you want a specific motion, or if you would prefer that council refer it back to staff, just to have those types of discussions to come up with some sort of happy median based on the conversation here tonight.
If council is leaning towards, firstly, this matter, if you want, if greater discussions is deemed necessary, we could always take it to committee of the whole. If council does feel it's appropriate tonight to solidify the conclusion, I would need direction on which primary street would be the focus if we were looking to vary one street or the other. And we would need to get specific enough to say, please have the applicant construct sidewalks on X street and trees and lighting improvements. And then we would be able to work from there and reducing the improvements to only that, for example. But we would need to pass a resolution that says A, not B.
I just don't want to get into the nitty-gritty to say, you know what, you ought to put in 6 lights instead of 12. You ought to plant 10 trees instead of 20, because I don't know what makes sense, right?
That nitty-gritty is not necessary. If right now the intersection does have what's called a BC Hydro luminaire, it sits in place. The municipality pays a small rent charge on it on an annual basis, as well as all of our luminaires. It can stand, and it does provide intersection illumination. Whether that's enough for pedestrian safety, which tends to have this augmented lighting pattern or not, I can't answer at the present time. However, we could be directed to focus on that pedestrian safety, local improvements specific to an area of sidewalk if we were favoring one location or the other. We can also look to maintaining the open swales on both roads very simply by leaving the edge treatment in place, which would say no mountable curbing, or no curbing, for example. And then we would look to augment behind the existing infrastructure. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Day.
Well, working from the report and what I heard from council, I could propose a motion if we're ready for that, which is it's actually option 3 and 4, but with some exceptions. So it would be to agree to the applicant's request to vary the frontage works that are required by bylaw 285 for the proposed subdivision to nil on Anchorage Avenue, and authorize for issuance, development permit, etc., and including A, vary the road width from 10 meters to the existing width of 7 meters, not endorse B or C, endorse D, to vary the underground storm drainage to nil except for what is necessary to provide a service connection for lots A and B, and then not E, and that staff be directed to obtain cash in lieu for improvements to Millburn so that the timing of the improvements can be related to a neighborhood concept with the establishment of a reserve fund for local improvements. And I would so move.
Did we have a seconder?
Second.
Discussion? Councillor Knott?
Not really part of the discussion, but one of the questions that came up at public participation was those speed boards have been up there for almost a year. I have not seen a single piece of data out of them. I was wondering when that report was going to come to committee.
Through your worship, we are working together with so engineering is working together with the manager of communications. Our next step is to get the survey out. That survey will contain some high-level information with regard to the speed readers. Should council so decide, we can bring back a full report of that, but that is it's an awful lot of data. We were planning on, like I said, bringing forward a encapsulated version for people in April.
Follow-up question, do you have a schedule for that?
through your worship. We've been trying to get together for the past 2 weeks, and we're hoping to get the survey out to everybody in April. We were asked by members of the community to not send out anything during spring break because they were concerned that they would somehow miss that opportunity to speak.
Thank you. I don't want to make waves for staff, but we have been being nagged about this problem for probably 5 years now. We've proposed speed bumps and then reneged on that, and then we proposed them and then took them off. It's time we actually did something, and I'm looking very much forward to that coming to council or committee of the whole in a timely fashion. Thank you.
Okay, so we do have a motion on the floor for frontage improvements on Anchorage Avenue. Okay, yeah.
So can I just get a clarification on 4? Because the conversation I've had with you in the past, Brent, was cash in lieu was an issue. So I guess I'm wondering, why is this even on the table if it was an issue in the past?
Obtaining cash in lieu, which goes into a specific fund, specific to that improvement area, specific to the improvement, is not an issue. We can take that. We can take that money. What was outlined in my quick cover, as well as in the report, is the value of that money depreciates over the course of time. If with an intent to construct onto it, it can get added onto. That, in essence, forms a reserve fund, but we will not be able to, with cash in lieu, pick that money up out of that direct frontage and apply it to the top end of Millburn, for example.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Did anyone else have questions? Okay.
Just wanted to make sure, if I could, that because we took out the varying of the concrete sidewalk, and we've said that we're not asking for improvements on Anchorage, that we're asking for improvements on Millburn, but we haven't said anything about the sidewalks. So I'm assuming that the sidewalks will be included in the improvements through a neighborhood concept plan. Is that right?
Yes, to recap, what I've heard is that council does wish to see improvements on Millburn, but they are limited to the sidewalk, which will be constructed out of concrete and 1.5 meters, and lighting improvements. However, they are directing staff through that same motion to not request those works of the developer, but to obtain cash in lieu for those frontage works, so that could be timed later on. An example of that might be when a traffic calming initiative was better known.
Excellent. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm glad we clarified that. I'm actually not supportive of us not asking the developer to build on Anchorage. I think we've heard loud and clear through, for example, Rick Jeffries, that the Anchorage, Hockering, and whatever the third road is, I'm drawing a blank, Aloha, are being used basically as rat runs, and our people are cutting through them right now, and that I anticipate that that's going to get worse, not better. In the future, and I actually think that we need to have a long-term vision that those 3 roads will also require sidewalks down in the future, and so I'm actually supportive of sidewalks on both Anchorage and Millburn. And if this motion will be excluding Anchorage, I will not be supporting it.
Anyone else?
I just was going to suggest to Councillor Martin, through the chair, that if he wanted to make an amendment, that would be perfectly in order.
All right. Thank you, Councillor Day. I will make an amendment to include Anchorage sidewalks.
Second.
Okay, any other discussion?
I think we have to vote on the motion or the amendment first.
Or the amendment? Okay. Seconder on the amendment?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, all those in favor? Opposed? One opposed. Okay, so we have the recommendation as amended.
Is everyone clear on the recommendation?
Yes, please. I was just going to say.
Through your worship, Chair. So what I've heard, and sorry, thank you for the opportunity. What I've heard is that yes, both Anchorage and Millburn will receive a degree of frontage improvements. That those frontage improvements will be limited to sidewalk, of concrete in nature. It'll be situated in such a manner to not interfere with the natural drainage or the swale that's presently in place. It will not include curbing, but will include lighting. So lighting, sidewalk on both streets. Yes?
Sounds good to everyone? Okay, so all those in favor? Opposed? One opposed. Okay, so that takes us to the next topic, Finance and Administration, 7.2.1, report from the Director of Finance regarding our 5-year financial plan.
Save the best for last. Good evening, Madam Chairwoman, Council, and members of the public. Before you, you have a draft bylaw, bylaw 1720, that is our proposed 2018 financial plan bylaw. Incidentally, I had planned on providing a very brief oral presentation today, primarily because we have discussed the budget at length in the proceeding for Committee of the Whole meetings. However, I'm more than happy to answer the questions that were posed in the gallery today. And most importantly, I'll remain accessible to any members of the public who wishes to ask questions about the budget at any moment. As you are likely aware, financial plan bylaw is due by legislation to be adopted prior to May 15th. So we are moving along in the process right on time. Assuming things go well tonight and the bylaw receives first, second, third reading, final adoption would be scheduled for April 23rd, which is approximately one council meeting ahead of schedule, because there would be only one council meeting after that date to which adopt a bylaw. So as I mentioned, the financial plan bylaw represents council discussion and direction at the committee level over the 4 preceding Committee of the Whole. The bylaw is presented in a different format than what you may be used to seeing in the large financial plan document that has been presented. However, it's rolled up to a more consistent financial reporting detail level. There is some proposed changes to the policy. There is some required policy in the financial plan bylaw by the community charter. Much of the policy terminology has remained very consistent in the city's financial plan bylaws over the number of years. Some of the terminology that's been updated includes terminology to support our sustainable infrastructure planning plans. And some other minor housekeeping amendments. So to answer some of the questions that were posed in the gallery regarding growth. Now, if my answer is too vague, I do apologize, but growth can mean a number of things. First of all, the financial, you may recall from the financial plan presentations prior to this meeting that property taxes were separated in a number of different categories. First of all, you have organic property tax growth, and then you have new construction revenue, which was separated. And you know, quite to put it quite candidly, you know, staff lacked expertise to predict housing growth to any specific extent. So conservative measures were used to predict new construction revenue in years 2019 through 2022. But outside of new construction revenue that had been included in the financial plan, property tax growth ranges between, I believe, 2.9% and 3.2%, of course, which is subject to growth in operating expenditures. With regards to the questions about fines and penalty revenue, I would be delighted to see the revenue fall over the years, but I did put forward expected increases in fines and penalties. However, some of the drivers behind the fine and penalty growth really relate to the growth in property taxes. So, fines as a percentage of property taxes has remained relatively consistent. So if property taxes grow by 3%, fines and penalties will typically grow by 3%. Mind you, fines and penalties in the financial plan have actually been projected to fall, not fall on gross terms, but fall as a percentage of total property taxes. So it's actually a optimistic perspective, hoping that some taxpayers who pay habitually late will choose to pay on time. The other component of that is for taxes that are over a year due or a year or two due, there is a legislated arrears and delinquent interest. And since central bank rates continue to rise, revenue from that interest is projected to continue to rise. And the last question posed in the gallery, which is a very good question related to our reserves that we are spending from and reserves that we are contributing to this year. And as correctly pointed out, we are contributing less to our reserves than we are spending on capital projects. And that is indicative of capital expenditures over the long term. So the idea behind reserve funding is to save so that when the expenditures do occur, property taxes aren't impacted, so that we can incur large expenditures in a year that we save for sustainably. And so a couple of main examples in this year's financial plan include the fire truck, which is $900,000. We've been sustainably saving for that, and the infrastructure replacement plan for our fire vehicles is sustainable. So we've projected into the future what our costs are going to be, and we believe the annual contribution that we make to that will pay for itself, so we won't have to take on debt to purchase fire vehicles. Another example would be the affordable housing contribution. So we've accepted amenities for affordable housing, and that's placed in a reserve. This year we anticipate spending out of that reserve to the tune of over $500,000, and those were on some specific affordable housing projects. And there's other capital expenditures that are occurring this year. But as I mentioned, I appreciate the question very much, because over the long term, if we continue to spend more out of reserves than we contribute to our reserves, we would be in trouble. So with that, the staff recommendation is before you, asking for first, the second, and third reading of the financial plan bylaw 1720. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'm sure the public certainly appreciates you answering those questions. Did council have any questions or comments? Councillor Day?
Thank you. I was reminded by a member of public the other day about the deferral of taxes, and I just wanted to make sure I was giving the correct answer. When people are able to defer taxes, does that leave the city in a shortfall position?
Through the chair, no, it doesn't. The province will issue us a check for those deferred taxes.
Thank you. That was what I had told them, so yay, I was right.
Anyone else on council? Okay. And so we just received the report.
Through the chair. The next item on your agenda will be requesting first, second, and third reading of the bylaw.
Do we want receipt, or this is fine?
A motion is not required.
Okay. Okay, so next on to the bylaws. 8.1, bylaw number 1720 for first, second, and third reading, 5-year financial plan for 2018 to 2022.
Move introduction, Madam Chair.
Second.
All those in favor? Opposed? Second reading?
Move second.
Second.
All those in favor? Opposed? None. Discussion? None.
Second.
Discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Okay, nothing to release from in camera.
Move adjournment.
I
saw
All those in
winding up.
favor?
Yeah, I was
Good. Opposed?